Welcome to the show. This edition of the Patrick Coffin Show is brought to you by Covenant Eyes. Go to covenanteyes.com, put my name in as a coupon code, Patrick, Patrick. You get 30 days for free to test drive this bad boy. What's Covenant Eyes? In my mind, it's the best software blocker for pornography and accountability. So if you or someone you know is mired in the nefarious web called pornography and they want to stop, go to zero, then check out Covenant Eyes. At least give it a test drive. It's www.covenanteyes.com. My name, Patrick, as a coupon code gets you 30 days for free. Today we're going to talk about the work of famed Dutch psychiatrist Dr. Conrad Baars and the prophetic and accurate things he was writing and speaking about in the 1960s and 70s about the priesthood. This is the second in our series on the roots of the priestly abuse crisis, and today we're honored to have Dr. Baars' daughter unpack the work of her father, his legacy, and why it's still so urgently important. Right here on The Patrick Coffin Show. Don't go away. It is a great honor to be speaking once again with Dr. Suzanne Baars, director of In His Image Christian Counseling in Irving, Texas. The daughter of Dr. Conrad Baars has been a clinician both in hospital and outpatient settings since 1986. And her dad, Dr. Conrad Baars, who died in 1981, was a pioneer in the field of Catholic psychiatry. Sue, thanks for joining us here on the Patrick Coffin Show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you again.
I enjoyed our conversation inside Coffin Nation as a Transform You expert, and great feedback on just the power of affirmation and the insights that your father and his collaborator, Anna Terruwe, gave to the church and to the world. So it'll be fun to do a deep dive on something slightly different, maybe more broad.
Yes.
For folks who've never heard of your father, I think this is a movie yet to be made. It's so unlikely that if you presented it as a summary on the desk of some Hollywood executive, you'd say, no, that couldn't have happened. So he was in Rotterdam, right? Minding his own business, trying to, going to think about medical school. Take it from there.
Yeah, he was in medical school, born in Rotterdam in the Netherlands, and probably was in his, I'm not sure, early 20s.
Yeah.
And this is during the early occupation of the Netherlands by the Nazis. And like you said, minding his own business, going to school. And one day, about, I think, a year and a half to 2 years after the Nazis had occupied the country, they decided to raid the medical schools and all the higher education schools and take all those students essentially captive to the labor camps in Germany. And my father was one of, I think, maybe 6 students who were able to escape and hide somewhere in the building so that they weren't taken away. And then he went down and he joined the Dutch underground to the resistance against the Nazis in the Netherlands. Then when he and his friends realized that they couldn't, they were going to be captured, then they went into France, into Belgium, and they did that for, I think it was about a year, and they realized they were going to be captured, that the Nazis, the Gestapo, knew what they were doing. So they tried to flee into Spain, leaving from Lourdes, and then they were captured in the Pyrenees trying to get into Spain, and then he was sent to Buchenwald concentration camp, where he was for about a year and a half before they were liberated by the U.S. forces.
Kind of like Von Trapp family style, up through the mountains. I read in the book, I should mention the book we're going to be diving into. It's called I Will Give Them a New Heart, Reflections on the Priesthood and the Renewal of the Church, co-edited by you, a kind of a collation of your father's writings. And I read his account of it, freezing, awful conditions in the mountains, snowstorm. And what did your father say? I was never so delighted to see the Gestapo in my life. Something like that.
It was the only time.
Right.
It was the only time because they were freezing and, they thought they were going to die. I think several people did freeze to death. And so, it was like the only time he was actually relieved to see help coming, but he knew what was coming after that. So it was imprisonment.
Your father wrote
So after that, after the war, he went back home for about 6 months. He was helping translate, helping the Americans translate, the things that were going on or had happened. And then he went home for a little while, and then he emigrated to the United States, where I think he finished his residency and then went into the field of psychiatry.
He had a great love for America, didn't he?
He did. He always wanted to be an American citizen and really saw it as a harbinger of freedom, which it is and was. And of course, he was very grateful for the Patton's forces for liberating Buchenwald. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. He wouldn't be here.
Right.
A lot of people wouldn't be here. Yeah. So, and then followed through, essentially just in brief, was a psychiatrist, I think, in a state hospital or several state hospitals for about 10 years. Got very disillusioned because the only type of the focus that they had back then in the 40s and 50s was Freud, which was very secular, and he felt like he couldn't help anybody, was thinking about moving into another specialty in medicine, and providentially decided to go to one more conference in Switzerland, and he thought, well, if this doesn't work out, then I'm just going to go to another specialty. That'll be God's sign that I'm supposed to leave. He gets there, goes all the way to Switzerland, and the speaker doesn't show up. So he's like, oh, okay, well, that's the sign. This goes back, always was visiting he visited the family, and he met with, when he went to Europe, and he met with a cousin of his who was a Benedictine monk, and told him the story and what he was planning to do, and providentially, this monk knew of Terruwe's work, and gave my father her dissertation, which was called the Neurosis in the Light of Rational Psychology, which is sort of like the Thomistic psychology of that time. It's not called that anymore, I don't think.
Yeah. She's also Dutch-born, right? Dr. Anna Terruwe, for folks who don't know.
Yeah, she lived in the Netherlands, so she's not as well known here in the States. But her work, once he read her work, it just electrified him. It became the focus of his work, and he promoted it and translated it and wrote his own books on it, till the end of his life. He thought it was very important. And his work is really a blessing to me because it really has helped me, in my work, and it really was why I went into the field. So that's why I'm here, wanting to keep this going and help more people understand it. This is very important.
One of the things that struck me about your father's account of being liberated from Buchenwald after spending 19 months there, lost most of his teeth, developed a heart problem. He said 1,000 men walked into the camp under guard, and then 6 walked out, liberated by, as you say, Patton's forces. And he said something that really struck me. He said, partly what kept me alive was my anger.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Not wanting to give the blankety blanks the pleasure of having some smell of victory because he would die. That's a very interesting motivation, isn't it? Yeah, because I think when you read other accounts, mainly not Christian accounts, I think, the ones that are more famous, a lot of them would say, and I think my father even said in his autobiography, is that people would lose hope in the camps, and they would die just because they were hopeless. They thought this was it. And that's why he would always say later on in his life, and he would talk about the importance of anger, which kept him alive, because he didn't want to give them the satisfaction of knowing that they could beat him. Right. He was angry at them for depriving him of his liberty. So, that along with some other factors, just the fact that he was assigned into the infirmary helped him to survive. But yeah, it's a lot of damage, physical damage, and that's why he died young. He died in his 60s. So, and think of how different, or how even shorter his life would have been if he hadn't had those perks that being a medical staffer probably would have accorded him inside.
That's right. He might have died in the camp then, much because of the malnutrition.
Did your father have any contact, or did he ever mention the life or work of Viktor Frankl, who's got a similar story?
I think, I don't remember him ever mentioning him, but I'm pretty sure he probably had that book in his library. I know we have it in the house, and I just don't remember.
Man's Search for Meaning, yeah.
Man's Search for Meaning, which was really excellent,
I'll put that in the show notes at patrickcoffin.media for people who are just listening to the show for the first time. So anger. A lot of Christians think of anger as just one of the 7 deadly sins. I remember growing up, there was a kind of an unspoken rule. If I'd said, I hate cauliflower, or I hate my math teacher, I would be corrected. Oh, no, don't hate, honey. You can strongly dislike. And one insight from your father, based on his being marinated in the teaching of Thomas Aquinas on the emotional life, is that anger is just a synonym for strong dislike, right? Or hatred, rather.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and we need that emotion, because if we want to be able to love deeply, because we're called in the gospel to love others, and actually the gospel is really not commanding us to feel love for others, it's commanding us to treat others with charity. But if we want to be able to deepen that, and this is part of what they took away from St. Thomas, my father in Terruwe, was we want to be able to deepen that, and we want to be able to also feel love for people eventually, hopefully, at least in some cases. We also have to be able to hate. And sometimes that means we're going to hate people. Now, that doesn't mean we will evil for them.
Or judge them.
Or judge them, because that's not our place. We might want to judge their behavior because it could be evil, it could be irritating. But hate actually just gives us information. My father would talk about the emotions as motors, because that's really where the word emotion comes from in Latin. Right. Ex movere is just to move. And you're moved in a particular way with hate and with love, which are opposites according to Aquinas, and we can see that very easily. But we're moved with hatred when we think, well, this person is hurting me, or they're hurting my loved one, or they're speaking ill of God, or they're saying something that's a lie. And so that emotion should be, if it's not allowed to arise spontaneously, then we're sort of incapacitating ourselves to hate what is evil. And if we're called to stand up for what is good and right and beautiful and what is true, we have to be able to love as well as hate, and to desire what is good, but also to want to avoid what is evil. So the emotions are simply there to help us. They don't tell us what to do. Our intellect and our intellect tells us what to do. Our reason, informed by faith as Christians, as Catholics, informs us what to do. I mean, when we feel hate or anger, we might have 5 options to choose from, and one of them might be really bad, or 3 of them might be really bad or inappropriate, or you might say that, they might be immoral. In some cases, it might just get you, if you expressed it, to lose your job. Well, you want to pick the right choice, but that's a matter of your intellect and then your will. And we can also get the converse of this is that the emotions aren't necessary for us to do what is good, but they do help us to do what is good. And they move us, like some of the emotions, what we're calling now the assertive drive.
What did Thomas call the assertive drive? What was the more Thomistic classical language?
He called it the irascible passions. And then he called what we call the pleasure emotions, he called that the concupiscible passions.
I see.
And those emotions, to clarify, those emotions are love, desire, and joy, and then their opposites, hate, dislike, or dislike, aversion, and sadness. And if you look at, if anybody's that's watching this thinks about it, if they want to look up there's a book called The Theology of Christian Perfection, which is by Antonio Royo and Jordan Allman. So they're moral theologians. They were Dominicans. And they said that what St. Thomas means by concupiscible, because that really has a very pejorative meaning for
Catholics. It does,
Catholics.
Concupiscence, right?
Yeah, it means, well, that's what got us into trouble with original sin, so we don't have anything to do with it. And so a lot of people then, I think, associate, like what you were saying before, Patrick, associate the feelings of hate and aversion and sadness as something we shouldn't feel, especially hate. Like you should only just dislike something.
Yeah, like really, really, really strongly, like with the vein bursting. But hate, just don't call it hate. Right.
But don't call it hate. But they said actually what St. Thomas means by that word concupiscible is simply pleasure. So those emotions actually just tell us, is something pleasurable for me? Do I experience it that way? Or is it not pleasurable? So do I experience it as good or as bad? And so it's really morally neutral. But it does help us to know something, right? So if we had to think through everything, we'd be exhausted. But our emotions actually sort of, bring us to, draw us to something as a good, or we want to move away from something because we can actually feel the goodness or evil of it. So it's very helpful for us. And the irascible passions, and this is why Terruwe and Baars decided to change the names because of that word concupiscence. Yep. And they're Latin terms. They're not very common. But they wanted to look at the other passions, the other set of emotions, which are hope and despair, which are opposites, and then fear and courage and anger. That's according to St. Thomas. So he's saying anger, in his mind, anger didn't have an opposite. But those emotions move us in a different way. They move us to act on something, to overcome a difficulty. Let's say, he would say hope and courage and anger would help us to overcome the arduous good, the difficult good, right? Or attain the difficult good. That's a better way to say it. Mm-hmm. And to move away, like despair just tells us, I can't do this. Well, it doesn't mean that anytime we feel an emotion, when we're using St. Thomas and this psychology that's based on it, doesn't mean we want to just sit in it. It informs us, and his central tenet in his philosophical psychology is, it is the nature of the emotions to be guided by reason. That actually the emotions, the passions, want to be guided by reason. So this psychology from Terruwe and Baars, based on Aquinas, is always at not just like something that's living a libertine life, a hedonistic life, where emotions are they tell you everything and you should just follow them. It's not that at all. It's that we want to look at what are the emotion, how do they inform us, how do they actually give us energy to move towards what is good, overcome evil. So we actually are strengthened with our emotions. Our emotions strengthen the will in its choice of the good. Now, the good has to be, to know what the good is and what evil is, we have to have been taught about that, probably intellectually, but also spiritually, and that takes time. Yeah. But all of that fits together really well so that we can live as Christians, as Catholic Christians, we can live spontaneously and effortlessly, more effortlessly, not always, and even joyfully, because the emotions are helping us.
So I want to turn to the priesthood and your father's love of Catholic priests and his desire to help priests and bishops live affirmed lives and resolve things that needed resolving. I wanted to ask you about, because there's a hinge here, it seems to me, the Freudian model that was in place so strongly during and after World War II that your father got disillusioned with. The Freudians and all of the disciples of Freud and Kinsey, like Wilhelm Reich and so on, they essentially did not believe that you should have any kind of suppressive, self-denying mechanism when it came to let's pick on sex for a moment. The sexual desire is something that if you repress it, it's going to come out in some unhealthy ways. That model seems to have ruled to a certain degree over seminary training up to and even before the Second Vatican Council, where on the one hand you have this strict, over-pious, truly repressive, like unhealthy, like sexual feelings are bad. All appreciation, let's say, of a woman's beauty is to be denied because it's sinful. Right. And on the other hand, you have this total permissive Freudian secular model where I'm okay and you're okay, and so don't pick up the cross because that's religious superstition. It sounds like your father has the golden mean, avoiding the errors of the extremes. Is that a oversimplistic summary?
No, I think it's a very accurate summary. I think really what Dr. Terruwe did, because my father discovered her work, what she did was she was, I think probably back in the 30s, she had heard a talk by Redemptorist priest, Father Willem Deinstay, and it was on the neurosis in the light of rational psychology and Thomistic psychology. And so she began to look at like what the Catholic psychiatrists and therapists were concerned about with Freud was that they could not use his model because they would have to deny to their patients that there were any spiritual guidance for how they were to live their lives. Because Freud was saying, he came up with this brilliant discovery of repression, that repression caused certain problems. But then he made the error to say that, well, just like what you were saying, that if you're repressing, it's because you're repressing because you have these morals and you have faith, and that's causing you to repress. So what we get rid of is that.
Yeah, so the cure became worse than the disease.
Exactly. So I think her work was actually an answer to that, and it became the mean. Really, we could see then that St. Thomas gives us this beautiful mean, whereby we can have all our emotions, but we can learn to guide them. We can learn to cultivate them. Sort of like, I was thinking, it's like if you think about riding a horse. And, on the one hand, a person might say, well, I'm really afraid that the horse is going to run away with me. And so they just take the reins and they pull the reins so hard that the horse can't move, and it's a miserable ride. Mm-hmm. And the other person comes along and says, oh, well, the horse is just going to run away, which is fine. But we want to actually put a bridle on the horse. If the horse represents the emotions, put a bridle on the horse, you train the horse so that the horse actually responds to the rider in such a way that it's an easy ride and there's just minimal contact with the horse's mouth, with the horse itself, with your legs, and you can actually communicate so that the horse and rider become one.
Yeah.
That's a beautiful analogy for this.
It's a beautiful experience too. I've ridden full gallop on a beach, and there's some Zen flow that happens. It's described very well in Laura Hillenbrand's book Seabiscuit about the racehorse. It's a very interesting Zen thing. Anyway, didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, but if you live your life like that, then it's sort of that, that's the hedonistic model. That's the model that says, well, whatever I feel, I ought to express. Yeah, and that's not what my father or Aquinas or Terruwe were saying. They were saying, no, there's times when you shouldn't express things. In fact, that really could be the highest form of love. It's when you really love someone unselfishly. There may be many times when you restrain any expression for the good of the person. So they even looked at that through a Christian lens, that there's times to express things, but that has to be guided by what is reasonable in this case, what is the good of the other person, what is my good, am I willing to sacrifice that? But that's not anything near what Freud was teaching. So she came up with a very good model through examining St. Thomas, and then used it in this way in her psychiatry. And I think what happened probably, and this is not the fault of Vatican II, but I think after that, there was a lot of confusion in the church, and I think people began to go just sort of swing to the other extreme, probably because they had been repressing their emotions and been taught that way early on. And then I think all these abuses came about a lot because of that, because there wasn't this healthier way to look at it. And actually look at how do we guide the emotions and how do we live a Christian life, even having all our feelings, hatred, anger, the sexual feelings. How do we manage those and guide them in a benevolent way? And that's really what St. Thomas says, is that the reason is to guide the emotions benevolently. So I think my father and Terruwe actually gave a talk, and I may have mentioned this in the other podcasts that we had, but they gave a talk to, I believe it was to all the bishops in the world at the Vatican Synod in 1971. And one of that talk is in the book, I Will Give Them a New Heart.
Yes, I read it.
Yeah, so it was really looking at, this is what we need to have. This is what psychiatrists and therapists need to know in order to help people to balance their emotions, not go back to repressing, not just let the emotions run wild or express everything that they feel, but learn slowly how to cultivate them and then guide them in a reasonable way so the person comes to rest, no matter what emotions he feels.
Yeah. And here you have whole groups of religious sisters, like the IHM sisters on the West Coast, almost overnight fleeing the nunnery, giving into whatever romantic things that they were feeling. Group therapy, Carl Rogers, right? I think
and that's it's Carl Rogers and one of his associates, William Colson, and Colson recanted, and that's actually on the internet if anybody wants to look it up. And it was very, very humble, I think, that he told the real story behind that. But one of the points I want to make, Patrick, is people will oftentimes, every once in a while, people will say when I give a talk on Thomistic psychology or on affirmation in particular, they'll say, well, isn't this just Rogerian? Isn't it just from Carl Rogers? Isn't it just person-centered therapy? And I think there's a very big difference. It may look the same, but for number one, I think that the whole concept of affirmation goes much more deeply into what does it mean to be present to another person. The other side of that is, I think Rogers, what did he call it? Unconditional positive regard. That's what people will ask me. But essentially, Rogers was not, he did not define it in the same way that affirmation is a way of being present, fully present to the person. It was really simply mirroring whatever the person thought and felt, and then essentially, the way I understand it is, go for it. Like if that is sort of blessing the feeling without any guidance from reason, the external reality, the fact that these women had already taken vows of celibacy and poverty. It was sort of like, well, if you feel that, essentially they gave some kind of a message like you can explore that.
Sure.
And that's not at all what authentic affirmation is, according to Baars and Terruwe.
Well, you could say that God loves me. Talk about unconditional positive regard from the uncreated holy God who made me and sustains me in being. He loves me. He doesn't love my sin. He doesn't love selfishness. He doesn't love, evil that I might commit. So, I mean, that's to me the distinguishing mark between the Rogerian model and what your father and Terruwe were trying to get across, is that the feelings have to be felt before they can be managed. Otherwise, by definition, you are repressing them.
That's right.
Sexual feelings, like thank God for my irritation. Thank God for my feelings of hatred. Thank God for my sexual feelings. Thank God for my boredom. Right. Because they're up and out. Now you can name them. And then feeling them does not mean acting on them.
No, it doesn't.
That's the key, it seems to me.
No, and in fact, if you don't allow them to be felt internally, they're going to manifest themselves somehow, usually in tension, restlessness, anxiety, sometimes depression. Mm-hmm. So as a therapist, we can sort of evaluate that and see what is going on, and how does the person manage. We just talk to them about how do they manage feelings. And oftentimes they don't pay any attention at all. So we have to teach them how to begin to do that. Mm-hmm. So yes, I mean, one of the points that my father makes in his book, Feeling and Healing Your Emotions, is that emotions are instruments just as, in a similar way, as your hands and your feet are. Mm-hmm. They're meant to take you someplace. Mm-hmm. But you can take your hand and you can decide, I'm going to hit somebody, I'm going to pick up a gun and shoot this guy. If it's in self-defense, that might be something else. But if it's just because I'm angry or an act of road rage, now I'm using these instruments in a bad way. But you wouldn't say it's my hand that just sinned.
That's right, yeah.
Only, the Lord used that as an analogy, but we would never say that. Like, well, the police aren't going to come and just arrest your hand.
Yeah, or take that one bullet away from you.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
They're going to say, you made a bad choice and you have to bear the consequences. Mm-hmm. So we want people to take on their emotions and acknowledge them and find out that it's not even a scary process. It's more an evaluative process, that now they have choices to make, and then they feel more free. And actually life becomes really more effortless when you have your emotions to draw on and just inform you. You don't have to follow them down any particular road. Sometimes it's a struggle, but it's not always a struggle.
Yeah, so we're fallen. There's always going to be missteps here and there. But I keep thinking about that Seabiscuit description of the horse and the rider becoming one, because the rider is the controller of the horse, not the other way around.
That is right. And I would say, using it as an analogy, you don't even want to say the rider is controlling the horse. The rider is sort of directing the horse, right? because when we're talking about reason and the emotions, we don't want to control the emotions, because that's what leads us to repression.
That's a good note. Yeah, I really meant guide, the one who's in charge, the captain, aboard.
I know that. I just wanted to make that clear for the listeners, is that it's more of a, like, instead of being a micromanager, you're just being a manager, and you really don't want your employees. You don't want to. Most people don't want to have their hand on everything their employee does. They want to give some direction, and they want their employees to do what they're supposed to do, and they didn't have to do it for them.
Your father, writing in the late 60s and early 70s about the priesthood and about emotional immaturity and what he, at least earlier on in his writing career, called deprivation neurosis, much of it's come true. I want to say 1972 or thereabouts, he estimates that, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm going off memory here from the book, that about 15% of priests are emotionally mature, who are living that balanced, affirmed life. Mm-hmm. Does that sound familiar? It was a number I went, wow, that's really low for being from the era before things really exploded. Yeah. I wonder what he would say now. Besides, I told you so.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I think he would say it's sort of a natural progression of how our society and our culture is. Because when you look at his book, Born Only Once, he's talking about what changes really could be made to help decrease this whole syndrome. And that meant that you wanted to strengthen the family, that the whole concept of affirmation and being present and open to be moved by other people and other things that are foreign to us, but also to be able to think about those things in a reasonable manner. That's what would even help nations to deal with each other, right? Instead of always being afraid of what is different. He even applied it, I think, to nature and to ecology, to look at what is the good that God has put in the world. He wouldn't have put it as, like environmentalists would say, like it's the end all be all, but he would say these are gifts that God has given us. And if we don't really appreciate them and care for them, they're not going to be there for us. Yeah. But when we go back to the whole issue, the crisis in the priesthood, which is sort of continued, I think maybe in some ways it went underground, it's resurfaced, 17 years ago and now recently. It really is, I think, just a reflection of what's happened in the culture. That families have been more, even if they're intact, they're not always, I don't know what's a good way to put it. I don't want to use the word dysfunctional.
How about try this on for size? They're in a state of not being divorced, but they're not happily united.
Right, and what I've also seen, Patrick, is that, and I know this is with the best of intentions, is that many families, like they might have, especially even Catholic families or other Christian families, they have lots of kids, or maybe they just have a couple kids, but those kids are in many, many activities. And so this is what I hear all the time, and I see it, is that people are like moving their kids from one activity to the other. They're sort of juggling everything. It's like the shell game, getting kids from one place to another. Yeah. And what I've come to ask is, when do you actually sit down to a meal together? Do you ever do that during the week? And sometimes they will say they do it on Sunday. Sometimes they'll say maybe a little bit during the week, but most of the time it's a rare thing. And I think the reason why I ask that is, when do families even have time to be together, everybody together, where you're getting to know each other, you're hearing, it's like there's a continuity of family life where you know what happened yesterday and you're talking about, like what's going on, or how do you feel about that? Are you excited? Are you scared? You're sort of working out things. Parents are modeling how they interact with each other. There's not that, like they're in the car a lot, like they're together and they love each other. There's always, I can always tell there's a sense of really loving each other, but it's like there's something that is not happening that may also be detrimental. And then of course there's technology that pulls attention away.
The glass screen device scourge,
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's something that has sort of just contributed. And I do think that, our culture, even from the beginning, was sort of imbued with work ethic. And so we have to, even as Catholics, we're imbued with that. And that's not really a Catholic way of living, is to always be sort of driven and striving, which is something that my father talked about a lot, is that sort of overactivity of the assertive drive, the drive to be productive and accomplish things, which is not bad. Nobody's saying that is bad. It's that if you're striving, it's like there's never an end to the striving. There's never coming to rest, which has to do with the pleasure emotions, like being together, playing a game, telling jokes, doing something together, which in itself unites people. It lightens things. They learn about themselves and each other. They see, what does it mean to be family? They see, what does it mean to be father? What does it mean to be a son or a daughter? What does it mean to mother someone? And of course, there's no perfection there. It's more just having this capacity developed of, I know what it's like to be loved, and I know what it's like to be corrected and also be forgiven. But if there's a split in the family where there's just not enough time, which I think is sort of like a diabolical little plan, just to keep pulling families apart.
Often for good motives, like nothing wrong with soccer, nothing wrong with dancing, but then it becomes the be-all. And then Sunday morning, mass commitments begin to come second to the big game or ESPN or whatever sport thing.
Right, exactly.
And priests are not, they didn't come out of a void. No, they also grew up and they're products of the family and the culture as well.
Exactly.
Your father had a heart for priests and bishops. Mm-hmm. And one thing I noticed about when I was going through I Will Give Them a New Heart is that he did not like the term, he didn't like the label homosexual. He wanted to talk about the person in front of him and not reduce that person in all his complexity to one drive or one inclination.
Yes.
Which seems to me to be very affirming of that person, because the homosexual community seems kind of schizoid. On the one hand, they don't want to be labeled, they don't want to be reduced to that, and yet that's all they talk about.
Yeah. But I think that's a good observation, Patrick. I think that my father wanted to be able to acknowledge problems, and that's something that is talked about in the profession, is like, we don't want to label people because they're they get that label, they carry that label through life then. But I think the thing that may be missing for some schools of psychology is really, what does it mean to be present to the person in front of you? And that is the basis then of beginning healing and exploring this person who is very vulnerable, you're asking them to tell you about themselves. And that's a very delicate thing. They can feel very fragile. They can feel very defensive. And I think my father really wanted to honor that. Like, what was that like for them? And that we have to go at their pace, because there has to be a respect for the person.
Sure. One of the things that your father, I don't know if it was a talk or if it's a chapter that he contributed in this collection, that a real man, I'm summarizing now, a real man has to not only be willing to kind of get up and go after it, like fight an evil or attain a good, but he also has to be willing not only to be hurt, but to hurt.
Yes.
Which jumped off the page, but I realized he doesn't mean but to harm.
No.
And it seems to me that it belongs uniquely to masculinity, to masculine servant leadership, to be willing to, in excising an evil, it'll hurt someone else.
Yes.
You can't endlessly tolerate and smother with affection. Some things have to be like cancer. They've got to go.
Yes, exactly. And that really has its root theoretically in this idea that a man in particular, whether he's moving towards marriage or living as a single man, but as a priest, has to have this capacity to feel and be moved by what is bad, and then to fight it. And so they have to be able to move towards, if they have that capacity, they're not always worried about, is somebody going to have their feelings hurt? Are they going to be mad at me? Will they like me? Because then if they have moved through that, which they should have moved through like as a young boy, but if they're an adult and they're always thinking about that, or if anybody is, you're sort of incapacitated to fight for what is good, or even help the person to grow, because you don't want to hurt their feelings.
Yeah.
So you might have to, sometimes we do have to hurt people's feelings. I mean, even Jesus did.
He sure did. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he whitewashed sepulchers and, these other things that he would call lawyers and the Pharisees. I mean, they didn't exactly like him, but he was speaking the truth. And I think he spoke it. People will pick those scriptures out of context and say those to me like, well, that's really scary. I'm like, but who was he speaking to? He was speaking to people who had hardened hearts. Well, you have to really knock on that heart to break it open.
Yeah.
And of course, they weren't always, receptive to that. They actually killed him. But I mean, we need to be able to be like Jesus and not be afraid to speak the truth to someone who needs to hear it. It doesn't always mean that that's what we're called to do in every situation, of course. We have to evaluate that.
I refer to it as the Alice Cooper moment. No more Mr. Nice Guy. Like, don't, why is living a good life identified with being a people person 24/7? Your father certainly wasn't. He was not afraid to step out and say something that might get slapped down or someone else criticize him publicly, because people they're going to react the way they're going to react. And isn't this, the crisis of the priesthood seems to me to be a failure in exactly this, to refuse to fight evil, to stand against it, to punish an evildoer. It's a very maternal model of leadership to endlessly, I have to say, Pope Francis's constant referral to mercy. Well, mercy is great, and justice is great. Mm-hmm. We have to have compassion, but we also have to call people to what the standard is for their sake.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as you're saying that, I'm thinking, and I don't know exactly if I'm going to get this right, but when you say it's maternal, that's probably true, but I'm also thinking it's sort of a feminist way of looking at things, this rejection of the masculine, but it's also sort of taking on an extreme masculinity and, being in your face.
That's ironic, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It really is. But they're really, of course, like every man and woman has to have certain, like, characteristics of the opposite sex. But when we don't allow, or we don't help, let's put it this way, we don't help the man that is studying for priesthood or the priest to be able to develop that capacity to speak up, to say the truth, even though maybe his parishioners aren't going to be happy with him, or maybe other people in the church aren't going to be happy with him. Yeah. We incapacitate him. We sort of are hurting the flock as well. Right? So we want to help those men who are priests to be strong, and like you said at the beginning of this, to be able to hurt when it's necessary, like to prick the conscience. Yeah. That's really, we need that even in confession. And I'm by no means advocating for priests, like blowing somebody out of the water. It's more to actually look at like what's behind that sin, for example. What do you really need to look at within yourself that this keeps, maybe this is a pattern. So I think someone can hurt another person in a gentle way. There's a phrase in philosophy, I think it's St. Thomas, a thing is received according to the mode of the receiver. Mm-hmm. So we want to look at that, like what are they capable of receiving? But we do want to be able to have this capacity, a masculine capacity to fight evil and to speak the truth, because that also moves people in the pew. It can move them one way or another. It can move them with anger because they disagree or they feel hurt, or it can inspire them to act, to become better, to speak up themselves because the priest is doing it. Mm-hmm. So masculinity really needs to be cultivated and modeled, like in seminary, in the home, even in small scale. It doesn't have to be anything big. I think it just needs to be modeled that dads speak up for their sons, or take care of, they can be maternal or have more a feminine approach, like to be kind and compassionate, but they need to have that other side developed, especially the priest does as well, even though he is called to be a man of communion, but he needs to be able to hate what is evil and stand against it.
A friend of mine, whom I won't name, is a father of a large family, and he was with one of his daughters, a teenage daughter, in a donut shop. And as his daughter went to go back to the car, my friend noticed the clerk staring at her behind. And before she left the room, he said, "Look at me." And the guy looked at him and he said, "Don't you ever look at my daughter that way again." Mm-hmm. And he goes, "What are you talking about?" And he was ready to fight the clerk. And his daughter kind of awkwardly looked, and then his father nodded, and they left together. And he said, I'm never coming back here. And remember what I told you. And as they were driving away from the donut shop, the daughter became very emotional, said, "Dad, I'll never forget you doing this for me." Just the willingness to step in and say, enough.
Yeah, and that you might say that's an intellectual affirmation of that young man, because he wasn't moved with love for him. He was moved with anger that boy would look at his daughter in such a way, a demeaning way, right? Mm-hmm. But then for his daughter to witness that must have been so moving for her, obviously.
Yeah. And many dads would ignore it.
Yes, right. They would, because what do I do with that, right? Mm-hmm. What could I have done? But that's important to be able to do. I mean, that's a small thing,
sure,
but it's a huge thing. It's a huge thing.
So priests who grew up in this environment now, 50 years after the failed sexual revolution, long after Humanae Vitae was kind of put on the back burner, and priests eventually become bishops. And so the problem of weak men not able to render hurt and separate evildoers from the community and properly discipline as a father perpetuates itself. Your father's insights into priests and bishops really focused on being manly, by which he did not mean machismo, by which he did not mean authoritarian, right?
No.
And if there's a wound to your masculinity, whether it's through same-sex attraction or through just passivity, your ability to be a shepherd is greatly hobbled. Is that a good summary?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good summary, because it's the same thing that we're talking about. Is if that's the case, then you've got someone in authority who has never really learned, or is not, that's a better way to say it, has not developed the capacity to act in a strong way against what is evil or bad, and in the face of other people not liking what they're going to do or what they've done. And they have to be able to withstand that. How do we feel when we see bishops or we've seen popes who have stood against evil? Well, I could speak for myself. I am quite moved by that. I am very inspired by the words coming out of a bishop's or a pope's mouth, or the actions that they have taken. I'm very moved, and it's seared into my soul. This man cares about his flock, or he cares about me. He cares about the church, and he doesn't care what people think about him. And the bottom line, as you and I know, Patrick, is that none of us can control what anybody thinks about us, but we can. And my father used to tell us,
that.
Yeah, my father used to tell us, look, when you really are yourself, and I use this with my clients and in talks, I'll say, he says, when you are really yourself and you're living your life the best you can, people are going to have one of three responses to you. They're going to really like you because you're doing everything that they're just really impressed with. And the second person comes along and they're going to hate your guts because you think you're something and you're doing all this stuff and they don't like that. And the third person's going to come along and maybe you even get introduced to them and they walk away and somebody says to them, "Oh, I saw you just met Sue Baars." And they're going to go, "Who?" And we have to learn to live with that. And if we can see we have no control over other people's impressions, feelings, opinions, thoughts of us, that frees us up to live our lives the way we're supposed to live them and the way we want to live them, not in a selfish way.
That's really great. Kind of note to self. Your obsessions about what people are thinking about you, they might not be thinking about you at all.
That's
they
right.
might even not remember your name.
Well, that's right. And sometimes that's even true. People will come in and, what happened last week? I was so worried what you were thinking. And I'll say, what are you talking about? And then we talk about the fact they have spent the whole week worried about what I thought. And I didn't give it a second thought.
Yeah, right.
And usually, some of them, they're very hurt by that. And I'm just saying, that's sort of how life is, but that's a way to learn,
Here's right. Yeah. And I always like learning from people who are living with the person I want to be. And my spiritual father is Bishop Fulton Sheen. I think he was just firing on so many different pistons and levels, and creative, and with media and this deep, brainiac philosophical mind. Who are some priests and bishops that you admire? Maybe someone your father. I know he had a special love for St. John the 23rd. Who's the model of masculine leadership in the church?
I would say for me it was John Paul II. Just how he was, what he taught certainly, but how he was and how he lived his life. His life was a little bit parallel to my dad's. He
that's right.
in a concentration camp, but he fought the Nazis. He went to seminary. He wasn't afraid to speak the truth to people. I remember there was one time when he went to South America, and I don't remember what this priest did. I think he was into liberation theology, but you saw the picture of him pointing his finger at him.
I remember. And then it's Father Ernesto Cardinal.
Yeah.
Why I remember the name. Yeah, he tried to get down and kiss his ring, and John Paul II told him what time it was.
Yeah, none of it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but at the same time, he also, I've heard stories of people how he would treat them. There was a priest that I know from here, and he worked in the Vatican for a long time when John Paul was Pope. And he met him one time. I guess he would meet him periodically walking through the Vatican. Mm-hmm. And the Pope just came up to him, and he just sort of, like, the guy had a beard, and he just came up and goes, "Oh, well, so-and-so, and he said, it was so paternal how he treated me." Mm-hmm. So there was something about John Paul that just really was very paternal. In the sense that we're talking about. Like, he was compassionate, but he was definitely strong. Like, he would put his foot down, and this is the way it was, and a lot of people didn't like it. One of the other ones I love is Pope Benedict, the 16th. I think I've read a biography of his. He's a very gentle soul, and I think maybe he's not the same kind of person as John Paul was at all. But there's such a beauty in him and a goodness in him and a firmness. And of course, people took that out of context and made him, the watchdog of
the Panzer Cardinal, God's Rottweiler, which is hilarious. I've met the man. He's the opposite of a Rottweiler.
He's just the opposite. And I think, he was very firm. He knew the truth. He didn't come off the same way as John Paul, but he's very dear to me. I wished at some point I would be able to meet him. I doubt that'll happen, but
the saga of his abdication, people are going to be writing about it for hundreds of years. But he did crack down on things that John Paul II, in his slow decline, was unwilling or unable to go after. So he definitely had a nose for what is absolutely intolerable. He has a very strong record on that.
Yeah, exactly. Some of the other bishops that I know, well, I don't know Bishop Barron personally, but I have a lot of respect for him in his teaching. But I know Bishop Van and I know Archbishop Gomez, because they were both here in Texas. And I have a lot of respect for them.
Do you know Bishop Strickland in Tyler?
I've never met him.
Yeah, because he's to me, a real straight shooter.
Yeah.
Not a company man. If you want the guy who's going upstream from the general direction of the USCCB is usually Archbishop Alexander Sample of Portland, Joseph Strickland in Tyler, Texas, Charles Chaput, and so on, and they all have this thing in common. They're not. They don't. Pardon me. They're not wedded to conflict, but they're not afraid of it if it arrives.
Afraid. That's right. They're not just out there to fight, but they're not afraid conflict if that's what is necessary to get their point across. And I think that's what's admirable. Because someone who just goes to fight is just trying to prove a point, and I think just trying to draw attention or feel better about themselves. And that can be a very self-affirming way to think about living, which is not good.
How much in your clinical practice and anecdotally do you see pornography as one of the reasons that marriages end up divorcing and priesthoods end up ruining? Do you find a major role played by porn today?
Yeah, definitely. I can't give you a percentage, but I mean, oftentimes it's there, and oftentimes what we see is that there's a lot of denial about it. There's a denial when you say, well, look, this is a form of infidelity. There's a denial of, well, how can that be? I didn't have anything to do with the woman. And I'm like,
Yeah.
Well, you're with your wife, and that is a woman, you know.
Yeah.
So there's lots of denial there, and you know, I think there's not enough teaching by fathers to sons about pornography. I mean, I think there's a lot of literature out there now and a lot of programs, which I think is terrific. But I think fathers really need to be telling their sons, like, that this is an evil thing, and, you know, to help them to stay away from it, and how to think about women without like we were what we started with, without repressing any attraction to women, which is really normal. So, and, you know, the other problem that we encounter sometimes also is that women are into pornography too. You know, they get
that's on the rise. Yeah.
Or they go in through these romance novels that they escape into, and so they have these idealistic views of men, and of course then they have the images in their head, and of course there's always you might even call it, I don't even know if it's even soft porn anymore in movies, and that otherwise could be very good movies, but then they add these scenes in.
They just can't help themselves. You got to have that one scene. That's why VidAngel is such a great service. You can filter out whatever, you know, that there's every parent listening right now can think of classic movies they'd love to show their 13-year-old, but they can't, as is. Forget it. It's not going to happen. And I'm going to be speaking next with Dr. Judith Reisman, one of the first researchers to blow the lid off all the Kinsey deceptions, and she has very interesting insights. What's the shortest distance between our listeners and you? What's the best way to reach you?
The best way to reach me is to go to my website, which is baarsinstitute.com, and I'll spell it because Baars, nobody knows how to spell Baars. It's like going to the local bar, but you just put another A in it.
Like so A. See, I see what you did there.
That's right. BAARS Institute.com. So they can contact me. I can give them information if they're local for therapy. If they want to, a lot of times people will contact me about referrals in other states or countries. I'm not the person to come to. They should really go to catholictherapist.com to look for a referral if it's out of state or not locally.
Do you do Skype therapy by remote?
Well, I do it with people in Texas because we're really only allowed to do it. Otherwise, sometimes what I will do with people that are out of state is I'll do consultations with them. And so those are, I can give them some information and some help and guidance, but it's really strictly not therapy.
Do you speak at conferences from time to time?
Yeah, I speak at conferences a lot.
So if people want to contact you for that, Baars Institute, that's BAARS Institute.com.
That's right.
Terrific.
Exactly.
Well, Sue, I've learned a ton today. I know the listeners have too. I can't wait to get the feedback rolling back in. Thanks for being part of the series and part of Coffinlandia out here. I learned a ton. So thanks for being a gift. And I'm honored to connect with you because I love your father's work so much. So thanks.
Yeah. Thank you for having me very much, and I appreciate it.
All right. So this is the Patrick Coffin Show. Go to patrickcoffin.media and find links to all the resources that Dr. Baars or myself mentioned in today's broadcast. Remember, we're listener supported. If you're listening via YouTube, subscribe, rate, review. I'd love to hear your comments below and keep in touch. In the meantime, be a saint. What else is there? Hey, this is Patrick Coffin. If you like what you see and hear and you want to see and hear more, consider joining Coffin Nation as a full member. Just click right here and find out more about what that means. Nipsey, my fedora. That's Coffin Nation, the world's largest online community of culture builders. Click right here. See you on the inside.